Hi everyone, my name is Dennis, and this is my quick start guide to my app called GridTracks. GridTracks is essentially a double entry bookkeeping app, which is a form of a part of accounting. And so this guide will go over using the general journal and the general ledger within GridTracks, and this is part one of sort of this set of tutorials. Again, just a disclaimer, so this tutorial kind of just assumes that you already are familiar with double entry bookkeeping and just need a quick guide on how to start using GridTracks. If you are trying to learn double entry bookkeeping from scratch, you may want to look at my other videos where I will start going over from the very basics of double entry bookkeeping. Right, so just before I get in there, I just wanted to talk to you about the fact that there are two types of bookkeeping methods. So one is called the cash-based method and one is called the accrual-based method. So the cash-based method, basically you record transactions when cash changes hands. So if a customer pays me with cash or I pay my bill with cash, then I would record it at that time. But the problem here is that if you have clients that pay on credit or if you pay on credit, these don't show up immediately. So for example, maybe I paid my phone bill with my credit card. Well, that transaction is not going to show up till maybe 2 weeks later when I pay my credit card bill, because at the time that I paid for my phone bill, I was paying on credit and no cash had changed hands. So by virtue, I don't even know that this transaction has occurred until maybe 2 weeks later. And you can clearly see how that might be a problem for maybe when you're purchasing things like your products, because you have a sort of a bad sense of how much money you've spent because, well, certain transactions that you've made will not register for a couple of weeks later, which could be an issue. So basically the accrual-based bookkeeping method ensures that revenue and expenses are accounted for immediately. And so the good news about GridTracks is that it uses the accrual-based method. And so another thing to keep in mind is that when you're doing your taxes for the government, typically they expect you to use the accrual-based method, and there are only certain types of businesses that they actually allow you to use the cash-based method. So it's better to just start with the accrual-based to begin with, because then you don't have to confuse yourself and go in this big tangent. Right, so just as you expect from any sort of double entry bookkeeping app, there are two sort of main components. One is called the general journal and one is called the general ledger. So the general journal basically contains all the transactions that you are recording from a set date. And so you can see here that I actually have two transactions posted. One is on July the 4th, one is on July the 5th. Sometimes, well, in general journal, I might toggle between the two, but generally transactions are called journal entries, but sometimes I might call them transactions, but I mean the same thing. And the second part, of course, is the general ledger. And the general ledger basically contains all your accounts that you're monitoring. And so you can see here that I have a bunch of account entries that were taken from the general journal, and you can see that the total of my account is changing due to these entries. You can see that it's an asset called bank with an ID of 1010, and its current value is set to $13,057.87. And of course, the DR here represents a debit balance, as you would expect from an asset. Right. So, of course, before we can start creating journal entries, it's important to first create accounts that the journal entries modify. So, basically, as what you would expect, GridTracks follows the fundamental accounting equation, which just states that assets is equal to liabilities plus owner's equity CR. And so owner's equity CR is sort of my umbrella term for owner's equity credits, or net equity, basically. Right, and so, of course, because it follows the fundamental accounting equation, you can expect all the account types to function the way you expect them to. So we know that assets increase when debited, decrease when credited. Liabilities increase when credited, decrease when debited. Revenues increase when credited, decrease when debited. Expenses increase when debited, decrease when credited. Owner's equity DR here represents owner's equity debits or drawings and dividends. And those, of course, increase when debited, decrease when credited. And of course, your net worth or your owner's equity CR increases when credited, and decreases when debited, as you would expect. Right, so the second major component, of course, with any account is the account ID. So as much as the account type and the account name are super important, one of the most important part of any account is the ID, because that's how GridTracks differentiates between accounts. It doesn't care what the account type is when it comes to the order of accounts within your general ledger. That's only set by the account ID. So generally what that means is that you want your account ranges to be consistent for each account type, because otherwise you may have like liabilities that are between expenses or assets between revenues, and that would just become a giant messy nightmare. So I suggest you should follow a specific set of account ranges. So GridTracks does allow any account ID to be set between 1 and 9,999 inclusive, but I suggest you should follow a better, like, not a better, but like, I'm suggesting you a range. But you don't have to follow this, it's just, it's up to you. But assets typically should be from 1,000 to 1,999, liabilities from 2,000 to 2,999, owner's equity CR or net equity from 3,000 to 3,999, revenues from 4,000 to 4,999, expenses from 5,000 to 5,999, and of course, owner's equity DR or drawings and dividends from 6,000 to 6,999. Right, so now that I've sort of gone over how to create accounts and the fact that they follow as you would expect them to, now it's time to talk about the general journal and entries within the general journal. So here I have an example of the very first journal entry from my file. And so the first thing to notice is the date of entry. And so basically you can tell that this journal entry was posted on July the 4th. Right, so the thing about adding general journal entries is that GridTracks doesn't actually record the time of which a transaction happened, nor can you input a time that the transaction has happened, which means that when you're adding transactions with the same date, they will just end up being inserted one after another. And so the problem here is that when you're maybe reconciling with your bank account or whether you're reconciling with your credit card statement, these transactions with the same date may be out of order compared to what you see within your bank statement. And so if that is the case, you can move transactions up or down, but there's one condition. And the condition, of course, is that if you want to move a transaction up, the transaction above it must have the same date. And if you want to move a transaction down, the transaction below it must have the same date. You cannot, if you have a transaction on the 5th and the one below that's on the 6th, you cannot move the 5th one down, the one on the 5th down, because they have different dates, and it wouldn't make sense for the dates to be out of order. So this feature of moving up and down is mainly just to allow you to fine-tune entries that have the same date, but you want them in a different order. Right, so then the meat of the journal entries, of course, these three components, as well as the blank line, which is mainly for just to make the journal look a little nicer. It doesn't actually have a purpose other than that. But right, so here you can see that in the green we have the debits, the yellow we have the credits, and in the red we have description. So when it comes to debits and credits, the accounts that are being affected are always going to be shown in the format of account name, such as bank here, and then in brackets to the right, account ID. Of course, as you would expect, for debit posts, the debit column contains the amount debited and the credit column is blank. And for credit posts, of course, the amount debited is blank and then the amount credited has a value. Furthermore, if you have, say, 2 posts that are debits, or maybe like 3, more than 1 post that are credits, those are sorted by account ID as well. So you can see that bank here comes before ingredients expense because it has a lower account ID. And then finally, and then the next part is that, so credits are always indented compared to debits when it comes to the post column. And then finally, we have the description in red here. And so the description is always in italics. And so it describes what happened during this transaction. And so this is actually super important because within the general ledger, the account entries also use this description to sort of show, well, what happened during this account entry post. And then of course, as I mentioned, the blank line is just to look a lot nicer. Right, so the last part of the general journal is the line numbers. And this is actually really important because this is how the general journal communicates with the general ledger. So as you can see here, for example, we have this transaction posts to bank, and the bank post occurred on line 1. So when you go to the bank in the general ledger, you'll see that line 1 is referenced there as well, as I'll show in a little bit. but I just want to give you a little heads up. Right, so here I'm just going to show you sort of the relationship between the general ledger and the general journal. So as you can see here, the dates match up. So we know that this account entry here is from this transaction here. So because this transaction occurred on July the 4th, the account entry is also for July the 4th. Right, so the next one is the line number. So as I mentioned earlier, the line number is sort of how the general ledger and the general journal communicate with each other. So we can see clearly here that for the bank asset, this transaction has posted a dollar amount on the first line. So basically, the line number 1 is referring to this post here to bank. We also have the description, where here you can see that the description from the transaction or the journal entry is used here to describe the account entry, or like the fact that, well, why was bank debited by this amount? You'll notice that I'm not going to show you here, but for ingredients expense for this post and for the cupcake sales post, they would also have the same description. But of course, their debit and credit amounts will be different because they're different here. Of course, because this bank asset was being debited, you can see that in this column here, we are showing the bank balance being debited by this amount. If the bank asset was being credited, of course, the debit column would be blank here, and the credit column would have a value to it. And then finally, of course, within the general ledger, but not really associated with the general journal, is the total and, of course, this DR/CR column. So basically, of course, like one of the purposes of the general ledger is to sort of look at an account and see how its total value changes over time, or like per transaction. So you can see here that because I've applied a debit of $1,056, now my total has gone up to $8,556. And then in this next line, I'm also debiting my asset by another $500, which then brings the total up to $9,056, so on and so forth. And so, of course, the DR/CR here is, well, the thing about accounting, of course, is that we don't really do negatives. It's more when you switch the negatives, the account type flips. Sorry, not the account type, but the balance type flips. So if I had a negative asset, then it would have a credit balance instead of a debit balance. It's a little kind of confusing, but I'll go over more during my more in-depth tutorial. This is just more for a quick start guide, as mentioned earlier. But yeah, so basically here you can see that they all, because this is an asset and has a positive, this entire row shows DR, which means that the total has a debit balance. Actually, for all the accounts in general ledger, if the balance type is not the expected, so for example, for liabilities, a debit balance would be not expected. It would be considered negative. So for any non-expected balance type, those will show up in red. I don't show that here, but basically that's how it works. Right, so now that I have sort of gone over everything in this PowerPoint, I just want to demo the app for you. And so here I have the app, GridTracks, and I have this file open called July2021.gdt. And so you can see sort of like a quick accounts view of all your account types, as well as sort of their dollar value, as well as all the accounts. And then there's this quick journal view as well. But the first thing I want to take you to is, of course, the general ledger, which you can just click on right here. And so basically there are two ways you can sort of add accounts in your general ledger. Of course, I know this is accounts, but it's basically the general ledger page. But you can click here, this plus button, and this will take you to a dialog box that will allow you to add any account you want. So maybe I am adding another accounts receivable for someone named Joanne Joy. And of course, accounts receivable are assets. I'm just going to put that here. Now you'll notice this thing called the starting value, and the starting value is sort of the value of account before any transactions have been applied. And so, for example, maybe you have a bank account with $5,000 in it already, and you're putting that into you're adding this account to your document or your general ledger. The problem is that no transactions actually occurred that brings the value up to 5,000. So you may want to just apply the starting value here. This is actually more important for another reason, which is when you're preparing for the next accounting period, but that I'll get to in part 2 of this guide. But for now, I'm just going to set this starting value to 0 here. Oh, sorry, I think I already added Joanne Joy. I'm gonna, anyways, so she is here. But, right, so that's one way to add an account. The other way is to come to the modify accounts. You can always head back to the other page you saw by just hitting this button here. But I'm just gonna take you to modify accounts here. They can also add accounts by going to here and then hitting whatever you want. Of course, you can, like, even though I had set here the, like, because before, even though I had set here that I was going to make a liability account, I can always still change it here as well if I want to. And of course, and then the final thing I want to point out to you is this thing below down here. So notice that here it says starting value quantities. And basically, so the thing about GridTracks is that when you're making journal entries, those have to be balanced. So the number of debits posts you make must be equal to the number of credit posts you make. The problem is that GridTracks allows you to have a starting value for all your accounts. And so basically what that means is that if your starting values don't add up, so if your debit starting values are not equal to your credit starting values, then nothing is balanced and nothing will be balanced, because by adding balanced transactions to an imbalanced starting value set, well, that's not going to fix the unbalanced nature of original data. So it's really important that when you're adding a bunch of accounts with different starting values, that you come down here and you make sure that the difference is 0.00. Otherwise, nothing will be balanced and it'll be a big nightmare. Right, so now that I've shown you how to add accounts, I want to take you to the general journal now and show you how to add journal entries. Right, so I'm going to click here, and this basically takes me to the general journal. You can see here that I have a bunch of different journal entries already set up. They're always terminated by a blank line. The description's always in italics. And of course, as you saw earlier, the credit posts are indented. They're in this format that I mentioned. Of course, and of course the debit posts come before the credit posts. And of course, here you have the date and then the line number along the side. So if I want to add a new transaction, I just want to come here and hit the add transaction button. And so, right, so basically, I mentioned to you the 4 components. You have your date of transaction, you have your description of the transaction, you have your debit posts, and you have your credit posts. As well, you have the general journal preview, which kind of just shows you what the transaction or the entry will look like when it's inserted into your general journal. And it's actually it's actually updated automatically. But right, so I'm just gonna come here and right, so let's say that on the 15th of July I paid my let me see what, sorry, let's see, I paid off my utilities bill. Right, so now I have a description, and I have, as you can see down here, you can see now it's the description has been updated, as well as the date. And actually, if I were to maybe bring this to the 7th, you can see now that I have, because like it's in the middle, I can see transactions that are above and below, just for an idea of like what it would look like when I insert it. And of course, once I have this set up, I can basically apply posts. I can post debit and credit. So being this is a utilities expense, I'm going to post utilities expense maybe for $185, and I'm going to be paying for this with bank. So I'm going to post it here as well. You'll notice here that, of course, because transactions must be balanced, GridTracks makes it a little bit easier for you by telling you the total debits and the total credits. So that way you're not like overly, you don't have to like do mental math to figure out what's going on. And of course, now that I've added these posts in, you can see them show up here. If I add a new one, you'll see that they're sorted by account ID now, and actually it will update here too. But you'll notice that now it's not balanced, so if I try to accept changes, it's gonna tell me that I can't. So I'm just gonna just going to delete this guy. If you want to edit the post, you can come here to hit edit. And this is cancel, this is accept changes. But I'm just going to delete this guy because I don't want him. So, right. So now that I have this, I'm just going to go and accept changes. And this will allow me to add this transaction to this. Right. And then the second thing you can do is you can obviously edit a transaction in case you made a mistake. Or so like maybe I can change the date if I wanted to. I can, change the description, maybe borrow money again or something. I can delete posts, right? And I can do other stuff. And if I hit accept changes, it'll do the changes. Obviously, because I'm missing a bunch of information here, it's not going to let me. But I'm just going to cancel out, and it's just not going to do anything. And I can come back here. You can also, of course, delete transactions as well. Now, don't worry too much because GridTracks does have a very full undo redo. So you can clearly see here that there's actually a bunch of different undo redo events that you can trigger. So even if you delete a transaction by accident, it's super easy to just undo it. Right. And so, of course, there's a bunch of other commands here too as well. As I mentioned earlier, so like you'll notice here that I have 3 transactions that are all July the 5th. And I told you that if you want, you can reorder those by using the move up and move down. So notice here that because July 4th is the transaction above it, I'm actually not able to move it up because they have different dates. But I can move this one down if I wanted to, and I can move it down again. And at this point, I can't move it down anymore because the transaction below it has a different date. But of course, maybe I want to swap this one with the one above it, or I want to move this one below. And I can do whatever I want, just like to make it easier for me to reconcile my bank statements. Right, and then so there's also 2 other things here related to the journal. And so this is, GridTracks does support full find for your journal entry. So maybe if I want to look up, I don't know, like maybe just like I want to see all the bank stuff. So I look up 1010 and you'll see that I can like maybe go to the next one or the one after that. I can also scroll through here to see, well, which ones I want. And of course, and then there's also this thing called multi-select. And multi-select basically just allows you to select multiple journal entries. And like, notice that everything else is disabled because the purpose of multi-select is just to sort of allow you to copy multiple rows at the same time. It's not really designed for any other functionality, which is why, because it doesn't really make sense to be able to edit, add, delete, move up or move down, any sort of transaction. Like, because you're not selecting, you can be selecting multiple transactions. And when it comes to find, there's also an issue with that too. So that's why multi-select only works for, will disable everything else when you're using it. But anyways, I can always come here, hit copy. And if I go to this notepad file, I can obviously paste and you'll see that it shows up like this. Right. Sorry. Right. So I'm just going to undo this part. I'm going to click out. So the last part is this command called go to account. And so basically, as I mentioned earlier, the general ledger and the general journal are linked by these line numbers. And you'll see that like if I want to, maybe I can go, if I want to see this post and ingredients expense, I can just hit this button and it'll take me straight to the accounts page, straight to the account with the active account within the general ledger, and straight to the ingredients expense where it will highlight this row from the general journal. I want to point out to you that because go to account has to go to account, if you go to the description or the blank line, you'll see that go to account is now disabled. But right, so now that I've sort of shown you everything within the general journal, like how to add, edit accounts, delete accounts, add entries, delete entries, edit entries, as well as move up, move down, I want to just go to the general ledger now because that's sort of where the interesting stuff happens, right? For example, here I can see sort of how my total changes given each transaction that I've applied, as well as sort of, well, what does this transaction represent in this description, as well as whether it was a debit post or a credit post. So this is the part where I can sort of see how much money that I have, or maybe for my bank loan here, I can sort of see how much I owe the bank and over time how much that's changed. And of course, I can actually pick any account I want in this panel This panel contains all the accounts within my general ledger, and I can click on whichever one I want and see what the account entries are. I can see the type, the name, the ID, as well as the current value. And so, so basically, you'll notice that the account entries are kind of similar to what you would expect in the general journal. So the first thing to look at is this button right here. This button is called the account description button, and it allows you to sort of add information about the account. So this is really useful when you're doing inventory and you need to keep track of what you bought and what price you bought it at and how many you bought. Maybe for accounts receivable, this particular customer, you may want maybe her address, her email, her date of birth. So maybe like Emily Cash at gmail.com, for example. Oh, sorry, that should be address. And so on and so forth. Right, so, and then maybe for like payroll, you would want to put like SIN number and other things. Right, so that is this. You can also do find within account entries. You actually can't find within the account description, but you can find within the account entry. So maybe I want to just look for DR, and those will show up all here. I can go to the next one, the one before it. And then there's also multi-select here as well, which disables a bunch of the things. So maybe I just want to select all these guys, hit copy, and I come to Notepad again and paste it in, and you'll see that it's replicated. And then finally, you can also toggle to the journal from here by hitting this button. So if I want to see, what happened at line number 22 in the journal, I can just click on this guy and it'll take me directly to the journal. And of course, you'll notice too that you can't really modify anything here. You can't like change the description, you can't change the amounts, you can't reorder transactions. So if you do want to do that, you actually have to toggle here, deal with the modifications in this view, and then head back to the account after. I know it's a bit of inconvenience, but it just becomes too much of a mess if you can modify transactions within the general ledger as well as the general journal. It just makes more sense to modify them directly in the journal and then come back to the general ledger after to see what the changes are. Of course, so this allows you to select an active account, so you can modify edit the account information. So maybe if I want to change this to 1005, I could do that. Right, I'm going to undo that again just to bring it back, but I can do that. I can, of course, change the account type if I wanted to, right? I'm going to bring that back to asset again. And so these guys here are deprecation and deletion of accounts, but I don't want to, I'll get into that more when we talk about the next accounting period. It's not really that useful right now to discuss, so I'm just going to skip ahead, and you can figure that in the next video. The last thing I should point out is that there's a filter accounts thing right here, which allows, if you're looking for a specific account, you can use this to sort of cut down on your list of general ledger accounts. So maybe I just want to see assets. So I'll just type asset here, and you can see now I'm only seeing my assets. Maybe if I type in, I only want to see accounts that start with 1. So, or like maybe like 10. Now you only see accounts with 10 in them. Of course, these two have a 10 at the end, which is why they show up. And then finally, the last thing is modify accounts here. So as I showed you earlier, this is more of a bird's eye view of all your accounts. And what's nice is that it tells you everything from account name to ID to type, starting value, as well as the current value. So you have a better idea of what your generalized accounts are. And of course, I mentioned you have to be very careful with this difference here because you have to make sure these are balanced. Otherwise, your entire document will never be balanced because journal entries must be balanced as well. Right, so the last thing I want to point out is you can also edit accounts here as well. So if you just come to this guy right here, this pencil icon, it will allow you to edit the bank, the name, the ID, the type, and of course the starting value. Current value can't be changed, obviously, but the rest of it can. And you can confirm to confirm, cancel to cancel the changes, and maybe I'll show you here really quick that if you were to change this, it would actually reorder it for you because now this bank has a higher account ID than AR John Smith does. I'm just going to undo that really quickly again and just going to hit confirm, just going to hit cancel to bring it back. The last thing I want to point out to you is that this button right here will take you back to the general ledger, but it will specifically select this account. So if I go to bank loan and I hit this account, it will take me to bank loan. And if I were to click on, say maybe cupcake sales, it'll take me directly to cupcake sales. And I can do it one more time, maybe with utilities expense. If I click on this guy, it'll take me directly there. And of course, if I were to select this guy maybe and go to modify, it actually takes me here too as well. And right, so that's basically all there is when it comes to the general journal and the general ledger. Yeah, thanks so much for listening to this. I hope you enjoy using GridTracks.